They buried her alive, but the cowboy heard her cries at midnight. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the Wyoming sky when Jake Morrison first heard the crying. He'd been riding the night watch around the Double Bar Ranch for 3 years, and he knew every sound that belonged to the darkness. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of prairie grass in the wind, the occasional lowing of cattle settling for the night. But this sound was different. This sound made his blood run cold. It was a woman's voice, thin and desperate, carried on the night breeze like a ghost whisper. Jake pulled his horse to a stop and strained his ears, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. He'd been in the saddle for 14 hours, helping to move the herd to winter pasture, and bone-deep weariness could make a man hear things that weren't there. But there it was again, a faint crying, so weak it was barely more than a breath, coming from somewhere near the old cemetery on the hill. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt 45 at his hip. The Clearwater Cemetery had been abandoned for the better part of a decade, ever since the town moved closer to the railroad. Most folks avoided the place after dark, claiming it was haunted. Jake had never put much stock in ghost stories, but something about that crying made his skin crawl. He urged his horse toward the sound, picking his way carefully through the sagebrush and rocky outcroppings. The cemetery sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, its weathered headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. Some of the graves were marked with elaborate carved angels, others with simple wooden crosses that had begun to lean and rot. Jake had been here only once before, years ago, to bury old Pete Garland, the ranch's former cook. As he drew closer, the crying became clearer, and Jake's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't coming from above ground. It was coming from beneath it. Someone was buried alive, and they were still breathing, still fighting for life in the suffocating darkness of their grave. Jake dismounted quickly and tied his horse to a broken fence post. He pulled out his pocket watch and squinted at it in the moonlight. Just past midnight. The crying seemed to be coming from a fresh grave near the center of the cemetery, marked by disturbed earth and wilted flowers. Jake knelt beside it and pressed his ear to the ground. "Hello?" he called softly. "Can you hear me?" The crying stopped for a moment, then resumed with renewed urgency. There was definitely someone down there, and they were alive. Jake's mind raced. He needed tools, a shovel, rope, maybe more help. But by the time he rode back to the ranch and returned with assistance, whoever was down there might be dead. He looked around desperately and spotted an old shovel leaning against a nearby headstone, probably left by the gravedigger. Jake grabbed it and began to dig, his movements frantic but careful. He couldn't risk hitting whoever was trapped below. As he worked, Jake's mind churned with questions. Who was buried here? How had they ended up alive in a grave? And why hadn't anyone else heard the crying? The Double Bar Ranch was only a mile away, but the wind patterns in the hill might have carried the sound away from the main buildings. The digging was backbreaking work. The earth was hard-packed clay mixed with rocks, and Jake's shoulders burned with the effort. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool night air. Every few minutes, he would stop and call down to the person below, receiving weak responses that told him they were still alive but fading fast. After what felt like hours, Jake's shovel struck wood. The coffin was only about 4 feet down, a shallow grave, probably dug in haste. Jake cleared the dirt from the top of the simple pine box and found that several air holes had been drilled through the lid. Someone had planned this, had wanted whoever was inside to live long enough to suffer. "I'm going to get you out," Jake called down. "Hold on just a little longer." He pried at the coffin lid with the shovel blade until it splintered and came loose. Inside, barely conscious and covered in dirt, was a young woman with long dark hair and a pale, dirt-streaked face. She wore a simple white dress that had once been clean, and her hands were bloody from clawing at the coffin lid. Jake reached down and carefully lifted her out, surprised by how light she was. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with delicate features and dark eyes that were wide with terror and exhaustion. She tried to speak but could only make hoarse, gasping sounds. "Easy there," Jake said gently, cradling her against his chest. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she managed to whisper, "Elena. Elena Vasquez." Jake's blood chilled. He knew that name. Elena Vasquez had supposedly died 3 days ago of consumption, according to what he'd heard in town. Her funeral had been held yesterday, with half of Clearwater in attendance. But here she was, very much alive, having been buried in what could only have been a deliberate attempt at murder. "Elena, I'm Jake Morrison. I work at the Double Bar Ranch. Who did this to you?" Before she could answer, Elena's eyes rolled back, and she fainted in his arms. Jake could feel her pulse, weak but steady, and her breathing was becoming more regular now that she was free from the coffin. But she was in desperate need of medical attention, water, and warmth. Jake carried Elena to his horse and managed to get her up into the saddle, supporting her unconscious form as he mounted behind her. The ride back to the ranch took 20 minutes, and Jake used the time to piece together what he knew about Elena Vasquez. She was the daughter of Miguel Vasquez, who owned a small farm on the outskirts of Clearwater. Miguel had come to Wyoming from Mexico 15 years earlier, with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than any man should have to. Over the years, he'd built his farm into a modest success, growing vegetables and raising chickens that he sold in town. But Miguel's success had made enemies. There were men in Clearwater who didn't like the idea of a Mexican immigrant prospering while they struggled. Jake had heard the ugly talk in the saloons, how Miguel was taking jobs from real Americans, how he should go back where he came from. The talk had gotten worse lately, especially since Elena had started teaching school to the Mexican children in the area. Elena was beautiful, educated, and fiercely independent, everything that threatened certain men in town. Jake had seen her a few times when he came to Clearwater for supplies, always walking with her head held high despite the hostile stares. She spoke perfect English and Spanish, could read and write better than most of the men who resented her, and wasn't afraid to stand up for herself or her students. As Jake rode through the night with Elena's unconscious form in his arms, he began to suspect who might be behind this attempted murder. Thomas Hartwell owned the largest ranch in the county and had been vocal about his opinions regarding Mexican immigrants. His son Robert had been pursuing Elena for months, making increasingly aggressive advances that she had firmly rejected. Just last week, Jake had heard that Robert had publicly declared that if he couldn't have Elena, no one could. The Double Bar Ranch was dark when Jake arrived, but he knew the foreman, Bill Crawford, would still be awake. Crawford was an insomniac who spent his sleepless nights reading dime novels by lamplight in the bunkhouse. Jake carried Elena to the main house and knocked on Crawford's door. Crawford opened the door in his long underwear, holding a rifle until he recognized Jake. "Morrison, what in hell? Who is that?" "Elena Vasquez. Someone buried her alive in the old cemetery. She needs help, Bill." Crawford's weathered face went pale. "Buried alive? Jesus Christ, bring her inside." They laid Elena on Crawford's narrow bed, and the foreman went to work with the practical efficiency of a man who'd seen his share of injuries and emergencies. He checked her pulse and breathing, examined her hands and arms for serious wounds, and sent Jake to fetch water and clean cloths. "She's dehydrated and in shock," Crawford said as he cleaned the dirt from Elena's face. "But she'll live thanks to you. How long was she down there?" "Hard to say. According to the town, she died 3 days ago and was buried yesterday. But someone drilled air holes in the coffin, so they meant for her to suffer." Crawford's jaw tightened. "Any idea who?" "I got my suspicions." Elena stirred and opened her eyes, looking around in confusion before focusing on Jake. You saved me." "Just happened to be riding by," Jake said modestly. "Can you tell us what happened?" Elena struggled to sit up, and Crawford helped her prop pillows behind her back. She accepted a cup of water gratefully and drank slowly before speaking. "It was Robert Hartwell and 2 of his men," she said, her voice still hoarse but growing stronger. "They came to my father's farm 3 nights ago. Robert said he wanted to talk to me privately, but when I refused, they grabbed me. They gave me something, put it in a cloth over my face. When I woke up, I was in that box." "Did they say anything? Give any reason?" Crawford asked. Elena's dark eyes flashed with anger. "Robert said I was getting too uppity for a Mexican girl, said I needed to learn my place, and if I wouldn't marry him and be grateful for the honor, then I deserved whatever happened to me. He said they were going to let everyone think I died of consumption, and by the time anyone found out the truth, it would be too late to prove anything." Jake felt rage building in his chest. The Hartwells were powerful people in the county, with enough money and influence to buy their way out of most troubles. They probably figured that even if someone eventually discovered Elena's body, there wouldn't be enough evidence to convict them of anything more serious than grave robbing. "Where's your father?" Jake asked. "Does he know what happened?" Elena's eyes filled with tears. "They told him I ran away to Denver because I was ashamed of being pregnant with Robert's child. Papa believed them. He was so disappointed in me, so angry. He wouldn't even look at me when they carried me out of the house." The cruelty of it hit Jake like a physical blow. Not only had they tried to murder Elena, but they destroyed her relationship with her father first, making sure she died believing that the man who loved her most in the world thought she was a disgrace. "We have to go to the sheriff," Crawford said. Elena shook her head weakly. "Sheriff Morrison is Robert's uncle. He won't believe me over them, especially not with me being Mexican. And even if he did, what proof do I have? My word against theirs." She was right, and Jake knew it. The law in Clearwater wasn't blind to skin color or social standing. A Mexican woman's testimony against the Hartwells would be worth less than nothing in court. "Then what do you want to do?" Jake asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at her bandaged hands. When she looked up, there was steel in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I want justice," she said quietly, "but not the kind that comes from a courtroom." Crawford and Jake exchanged glances. They both knew what she was suggesting, and they both knew she was right. Sometimes on the frontier, a man or woman had to make their own justice. "What did you have in mind?" Crawford asked carefully. Over the next hour, Elena laid out a plan that was both simple and brilliant. The Hartwells thought she was dead and buried. That gave her an advantage they couldn't anticipate. She wanted to use that advantage to expose them publicly in a way that would ruin them socially and financially, even if it couldn't put them in prison. Jake found himself impressed by Elena's intelligence and determination. She'd been through hell, literally buried alive. But instead of cowering or seeking revenge through violence, she was thinking strategically. She understood that the Hartwells' power came from their reputation and social standing in the community. Destroy that, and their influence would crumble. The plan required careful timing and several accomplices, but Crawford had connections throughout the county. Ranch hands, small farmers, shop owners who had their own grievances against the Hartwells. By dawn, they had a network of people ready to help, all sworn to secrecy until the right moment. Elena spent the next 2 days recovering her strength while Jake and Crawford made preparations. She insisted on writing a detailed account of what had happened to her, including dates, times, and descriptions of Robert Hartwell's previous harassment. She also wrote a letter to her father, explaining the truth and begging his forgiveness. On the third day, Elena was ready to make her move. The Hartwells were hosting their annual harvest celebration, a big party where all the prominent families in the county would gather at their ranch. It was the perfect opportunity to make a public accusation that couldn't be ignored or covered up. Jake helped Elena prepare for the confrontation. She had lost weight during her ordeal, and her face bore the marks of her suffering, but she insisted on dressing in her finest clothes. A blue dress her mother had made before she died, with her dark hair pinned up elegantly. She looked beautiful, but also formidable, like a woman who had stared death in the face and emerged stronger. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked as they prepared to leave for the Hartwell Ranch. "Once you show yourself, there's no going back. They'll try to discredit you, maybe even claim you're a ghost or that you've gone mad." Elena smiled, and Jake saw something in her expression that reminded him of tempered steel, heated in fire and hammered into something unbreakable. "Let them try," she said. "I have something they don't expect, the truth, and witnesses who saw them bury me." The Hartwell Ranch was blazing with lights when Jake and Elena arrived. Carriages and horses filled the yard, and the sound of music and laughter drifted from the main house. Jake had traded his work clothes for his best suit, playing the role of Elena's escort. Crawford and several other ranch hands were already positioned around the property, ready to prevent anyone from leaving once Elena made her appearance. They waited until the party was in full swing before making their entrance. Jake escorted Elena through the front door and into the main parlor, where nearly 100 people were gathered, including most of the prominent families in the county. Conversations died as people noticed Elena, confusion and shock spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Robert Hartwell was standing near the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, laughing at something his father had said. When he saw Elena, the glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. His face went white as sheet. "Good evening, Robert," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "I hope you don't mind me crashing your party. I heard you had me buried a few days ago, but I thought I'd stop by to thank you in person." The room erupted in gasps and confused murmurs. Several women screamed, thinking they were seeing a ghost. Thomas Hartwell pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Elena Vasquez is dead. We all attended her funeral." "Did you?" Elena asked calmly. "Or did you attend the burial of an empty coffin while I was fighting for my life in a shallow grave?" She held up her bandaged hands. "These are from clawing at the coffin lid your son put me in, Mr. Hartwell. Would you like to see the splinters I pulled from my fingernails?" Robert finally found his voice. She's gone mad. The consumption must have affected her mind. She doesn't know what she's saying." Elena turned to face him directly, and Jake saw her draw herself up to her full height, every inch the school teacher who had commanded respect from her students. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Robert. I'm saying that you and two of your men kidnapped me from my father's farm, drugged me, and buried me alive because I refused to marry you. I'm saying that you told my father I was pregnant with your child and had run away in shame, breaking his heart and destroying my reputation. I'm saying that you are a coward and a would-be murderer who thought you could dispose of me like an unwanted animal." The crowd was in uproar now, voices raised in shock and disbelief. Some people were already edging toward the door, wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. But Elena wasn't finished. "I have witnesses," she continued, her voice rising above the noise. "Jake Morrison heard me crying from my grave and dug me out. Bill Crawford treated my injuries and can testify to my condition. And I have this." She pulled out a piece of torn fabric from her reticule, a piece of Robert's shirt that she had managed to tear off during the struggle at her father's farm. "Robert was wearing this shirt the night he kidnapped me. His initials are embroidered on the pocket, and there's blood on it from when I scratched his face. I'm sure if we look closely, we'll find matching scratches." All eyes turned to Robert, and sure enough, there were 3 parallel scratches on his left cheek, partially healed but still visible. He instinctively raised his hand to cover them. That doesn't prove anything," he stammered. "I could have gotten those anywhere." "Then you won't mind explaining them to Sheriff Patterson from the territorial capital," Elena said. "I've already sent him a detailed letter describing everything that happened, along with corroborating statements from my witnesses. He should be arriving tomorrow to investigate." Jake had to admire Elena's bluff. They hadn't actually contacted the territorial sheriff yet, but the threat was effective. Thomas Hartwell's face had gone from red to gray, and he was looking at his son with dawning horror. "Robert," he said slowly, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't do this thing." For a moment, Jake thought Robert might confess and throw himself on his father's mercy. But instead, the younger Hartwell's fear transformed into rage. "She's lying," he shouted. "It's all lies. She's a Mexican whore who's trying to destroy our family because I wouldn't marry her. You can't believe her over me." The racial slur hung in the air like a physical blow, and Jake saw several people in the crowd flinch. Even in a time and place where such language was common, using it against a woman who had just described being buried alive seemed particularly vicious. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled sadly. "Thank you, Robert. You just proved my point better than I could have myself." She turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know some of you don't think much of me because of where my father came from. I know some of you think I'm uppity for teaching children to read and write, for believing that education can lift people out of poverty regardless of the color of their skin. But I ask you this, what kind of community do you want to live in? One where a man can bury a woman alive because she won't submit to his advances? One where wealth and family name matter more than human decency?" She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm not asking you to like me or agree with my politics. I'm asking you to stand up for what's right, Because if Robert Hartwell can do this to me and get away with it, what's to stop him from doing it to your daughters if they displease him?" The room was silent now, the party atmosphere completely destroyed. Jake could see people processing Elena's words, weighing them against what they knew of the Hartwell's character. Several women were crying, and more than a few men looked sick. Thomas Hartwell seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. He looked at his son with disgust and disappointment. "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" Robert stared at his father in disbelief. "Get out of my house. Get out of my sight. You're no son of mine." "Papa, you can't believe her. She's lying." "No," Thomas said, his voice heavy with grief and shame. "She's not. I can see it in your eyes, boy. God help me, I can see that she's telling the truth." Robert looked around the room desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but found only disgusted faces and averted eyes. His reputation was destroyed, his social standing obliterated. Even if he escaped legal consequences, he would never be welcome in polite society again. He turned and fled from the room, pushing past people who stepped aside to avoid touching him. Jake heard a horse galloping away into the night a few minutes later. Thomas Hartwell approached Elena slowly, his hat in his hands. "Miss Vasquez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to apologize for what my son did. There are no words." Elena studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "Your son made his own choices, Mr. Hartwell. You're not responsible for them, but you can make sure justice is served by cooperating with the territorial authorities when they investigate." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Of course. Anything you need." The party was effectively over. People began leaving quietly, their conversations hushed and serious. Jake could hear snippets of their discussions, expressions of shock, admiration for Elena's courage, and angry condemnation of Robert Hartwell's actions. As the crowd thinned, Jake saw a familiar figure approaching through the doorway. Miguel Vasquez stood hesitantly at the threshold, his hat clutched in weathered hands, his eyes fixed on his daughter with an expression of desperate hope and shame. Elena saw him too, and her composed facade finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to her father, and Miguel caught her in his arms, both of them sobbing. "Mija," Miguel whispered, using the Spanish endearment for "my daughter. Forgive me. I should have known you would never do what they said. I should have believed in you." "It's not your fault, Papa. They were very convincing, and I know how it must have looked." Jake watched the reunion with a lump in his throat, thinking about how close they had all come to losing Elena forever. If he hadn't been riding night watch, if he hadn't heard her cries, if he had dismissed them as imagination or the wind. 3 months later, Jake was back on night watch, riding the same route around the Double Bar Ranch. But this time, he wasn't alone. Elena rode beside him on a gentle mare, wrapped in a warm coat against the November chill. Robert Hartwell had disappeared the night of the party and hadn't been seen since. Some said he'd fled to California. Others thought he might have gone to Mexico. The territorial sheriff had issued a warrant for his arrest, but Jake suspected they'd never see him again. Thomas Hartwell had sold his ranch and moved back east, unable to face the shame and social ostracism that followed his son's exposure. Before leaving, he had made a substantial financial contribution to Elena's school and to several Mexican families in the area, trying in some small way to atone for his son's crimes. Elena had become something of a local hero, her courage and dignity in the face of attempted murder, earning her respect even from people who had previously looked down on her. Her school had expanded, and she now taught not just Mexican children, but any child whose parents wanted them to have a better education than the inadequate public school could provide. "Penny for your thoughts," Elena said, breaking into Jake's reverie. "Just thinking about how different things could have been," Jake replied. "If I hadn't heard you that night." Elena reached over and took his hand. 3 weeks ago, she had accepted his proposal of marriage, and the engagement ring on her finger caught the moonlight. "But you did hear me," she said simply. "Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just luck. But you were there when I needed you most. That's what matters." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "I still can't believe you want to marry a simple cowboy." Elena laughed, the sound warm and happy in the cold night air. "Jake Morrison, There's nothing simple about you. You risked everything to save a woman you barely knew, and you stood by me when I needed justice. You're the best man I've ever known." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the familiar sounds of the night. The old cemetery was visible in the distance, but it no longer held any fear for either of them. Elena had faced her worst nightmare and emerged stronger. Jake had discovered that sometimes doing the right thing was its own reward. As they turned their horses back toward the ranch, Elena spoke again. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been so stubborn about riding night watch? Bill offered to give you day shifts plenty of times." Jake grinned. "Best decision I ever made, staying on nights. Otherwise, I might never have met the woman I'm going to marry. Or," Elena pointed out with a smile, "I might have died in that grave, and you'd never have known what you were missing." It was a sobering thought, but Jake pushed it away. Elena was alive, they were together, and they had a future to build. The past was behind them, buried like the empty coffin in the Clearwater Cemetery. The lights of the Double Bar Ranch came into view, warm and welcoming in the darkness. In a few hours, the sun would rise on another day, bringing new challenges and new possibilities. But for now, Jake was content to ride beside the woman he loved, knowing that sometimes the most extraordinary things could come from the most ordinary moments. Like a cowboy on night watch who happened to be in the right place at the right time to hear a cry for help in the darkness. As they approached the ranch, Elena turned to Jake one more time. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For listening, for believing, for not being afraid to do what was right, even when it was dangerous." Jake helped her down from her horse and pulled her into his arms, kissing her gently under the starlit sky. "I'd do it all again," he whispered against her lips. "Every single time." And as they walked hand in hand toward the warmth and light of home, Jake knew that some stories had endings worth fighting for, worth digging for in the cold, dark earth of a forgotten cemetery, worth standing up for in a room full of hostile faces, worth building a life on. Elena Vasquez had been buried alive, but she had emerged from that grave stronger and more determined than ever. And Jake Morrison, a simple cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time, had found not just a woman to save, but a woman to love and a purpose worth living for. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and the echo of a love story that had begun with a cry in the darkness and would continue for all the bright days to come.